In Georgia, Brian Kemp wants to take over 300,000 people off the voting rolls. Of course, he pulled over 1 million people off the voting rolls in the years before he ran against Stacey Abrams in that election, and that he won by a whisker. And in Wisconsin, where the Democratic governor was elected with 30,000 votes in the last election, and Donald Trump only won by, what, I think it was 23,000 votes, a judge has ordered 200,000 people to be knocked off the voting rolls. Is that a reasonable summary? And where else is this happening? What's going on here? And how can this be stopped? I mean, whatever happened to having a right to vote?
Yeah, it's going on a lot of places. I think Ohio is another big one. Florida is another big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think that it is a fair summary. And the problem is that there is, of course, people do move. People do change their address. That there's some process that you want to make sure that your voting rolls are accurate. But basically what they're doing is taking data that has proven to be inaccurate. I mean, that was the whole thing that happened in Wisconsin. They joined this organization called ERIC, which is actually a pretty good organization because it can help you identify and reach out to people who are eligible to vote but are not yet registered. But they also require you to do things where you send out notices to people who they found out may have moved. And they did this in 2017, and they found that tens of thousands of people were being incorrectly flagged and kicked off the rolls. So the Democrats and the Republicans on the Wisconsin election board, and it's an even split, unanimously decided that this time they're going to send out the letters, but they're not going to remove anyone for a couple of years while they figure out if this information is really accurate till 2021. And this is now a judge stepping in, essentially saying, no, I believe that this data is reliable data, and therefore under Wisconsin statute, you have to remove them within 30 days. So it's a big deal, and potentially these kinds of decisions very easily could swing 2020 because, you are dealing, Trump only won by 23,000 votes in 2016. So we don't know what's going to happen. It could be close again. It could not be. But if it is, taking people off the rolls, even a few thousand people that shouldn't be there, or 200,000 people, but maybe 50,000 of those or 25,000 of those are incorrectly removed, that can make a big difference. It
seems like there should be a threshold that would have to be proven, met before you remove somebody. I mean, they're so cavalier about taking people off the voting rolls. And for 20 years, this has been a major part of their strategy. I mean, back in 1981, the Republican Party was mailing postcards into largely African-American neighborhoods. And, and when they didn't come back, purging them, that got taken to court. There was a restraining order against the Republican Party for the better part of 20 years, as I recall. It was called caging back then. It was illegal. And then, the Supreme Court legalized this in this case with Ohio recently, and it's just like Katie bar the doors. Can you imagine if the Democrats were purging voters in rural areas, how the Republicans would respond?
Yeah, and of course, the larger point here is that there is no rush because the idea that, people are moving and then, driving back to their old state and voting illegally, it's just something that there's no evidence that ever really happens.
Right.
So the harm that they're trying to avoid is basically non-existent, but what they are doing is making it more difficult for people to vote. The good thing is in Wisconsin, and if there's anyone listening from Wisconsin or knows people from Wisconsin, even if you are kicked off, you could actually register at the polls that day. Just going to take you a little more time. So
you don't get an absentee ballot. I mean, a provisional ballot, which is a placebo ballot, is what Greg Pallas calls it.
You don't get that. You can go and register. You can go and register, and then cast your ballot. Now, obviously, that's another step, and every step you add makes it less likely that someone actually does cast their ballot.
The Motor Voter Act. Forget what year that was passed, but it was back in somewhere between the 70s and the 90s. The Motor Voter Act explicitly says that Americans have a right to vote. It's the first, I believe it's the first piece of legislation that explicitly says that. It has never, that provision of it has never been adjudicated to the best of my knowledge. Is there a voters' rights movement in the United States of any consequence right now? I know, Stacey Abrams has got this group down in Georgia, but I'm not even sure that they're laser focused on this one thing, like amending the Constitution to say that, it's a right of citizenship. Voting is a right of citizenship, period, full stop. I mean, they could even put in the provision, I suppose, unless you're imprisoned, because the 13th Amendment allows slavery for people who are convicted of crimes. But with that single exception, maybe, is there a movement to create a constitutional amendment, for example?
I don't think there's a lot of movement on that, and I think you make an important point, because what you're really doing now, and there's a lot of good work happening in the states, but you're really plugging holes. Maybe you're able to reverse, and they really were able to. Actually, Ohio did an interesting thing where they publicly released the data and allowed anyone to kind of check it against other data sets, and some guy at his kitchen table found, oh, look, you've incorrectly flagged 60,000 people, and they were able to fix it as a result. So there's people doing some good work, both on their own but also in groups. But you're kind of fighting a losing battle, because you can win one round, but then they'll come back up, and someone who becomes Secretary of State or whichever organization, whatever entity within that state controls the voting rolls, is going to try it again in another state, and you've got to fight it again. So they don't have to win every single time, but I think over the last decade, certainly, you've had increased barriers to voting, both this sort of purging of the voting rolls, and then, of course, the requirement of bringing an ID with you in order to vote is another big one.
Yeah, we spend, millions of dollars, major efforts, huge mobilizations to get people registered to vote, and then the Republicans, with just a brush of the hand, essentially, throw hundreds of thousands, millions of people off the voting rolls. It's astonishing.